Sometimes the most ordinary moments lead to the most extraordinary acts of courage. Sometimes a stranger's compassion becomes the thread that holds a shattered life together. Hakon Arvidson was traveling through the forests of ancient Norway when he heard a woman's desperate cries. He found Astrid, a noblewoman, alone and confused at her family's homestead. She couldn't remember what had happened to her or where her family had gone. The house was untouched, but her mind was clouded with fear. Despite her protests, the giant warrior stayed through the night to protect her. At dawn, armed men arrived claiming she had stolen something sacred, but when Hakon stood between them and the maiden, her memories came flooding back. These weren't temple guards. They were the killers who had destroyed her family. What terrible secret was worth murdering innocents to hide? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the ancient pines like memories refusing to fade, and Hakon Arvidson moved through the forest with the measured stride of a man who had learned patience through decades of warfare. At 43 winters, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes only from surviving when others have fallen. His weathered hands, scarred by countless battles, guided his horse along the narrow path that wound through Ulfheim's borderlands. The silver pendant caught the filtered sunlight as it swayed against Astrid's chest with each labored breath. She clutched it unconsciously, her fingers tracing the intricate knotwork that depicted two ravens intertwined, a design that spoke of noble bloodlines and ancient promises. The metal was warm against her palm, familiar in a way that her fractured memories could not yet explain. Hakon's eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering over the North Sea, took in every detail of the homestead as dawn painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. The house stood solid and undisturbed, its timber walls bearing no marks of violence or struggle. Wooden shutters hung properly on their hinges. The garden showed signs of recent tending, with herbs and vegetables growing in neat rows that spoke of a woman's careful attention. Yet the absence felt like a physical weight in the air. "Tell me again about your family," Hakon said, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to drawing truth from difficult situations. He knelt beside the cold fire pit, examining the ashes with the practiced eye of a tracker. "What do you remember of yesterday morning?" Astrid pressed her fingers to her temples, where a dull ache had settled like fog in a valley. "I remember breaking my fast with my mother. She was worried about something. A message that had arrived the night before. My father was away, traveling to the regional assembly." Her voice trembled, slightly. "Then there's nothing until I found myself standing in the doorway, calling for help that wouldn't come." The giant warrior's weathered features softened with understanding. In his years of service to various jarls and kings, he had seen enough battlefield trauma to recognize the signs of a mind protecting itself from unbearable truth. Sometimes the heart mercifully clouds what the eyes have witnessed, sparing the soul from breaking entirely. "The message." Hakon pressed gently, settling his considerable frame on a wooden stool that creaked under his weight. "Did your mother say who it came from?" Astrid's hand moved again to the pendant, her thumb working over the smooth silver as if it might unlock the secrets trapped in her mind. She spoke of old debts, old promises that some believed should be honored, while others thought them better left buried with the dead. The warrior's interest sharpened. In the complex web of Norse politics, old debts were often the threads from which new conflicts were woven. Families rose and fell based on promises made by their ancestors, oaths sworn in different times under different circumstances. Honor demanded that such debts be paid, but wisdom sometimes counseled otherwise. "Your family name," Hakon said, though something in his tone suggested he was beginning to form suspicions. "Astrid of what house?" "Gunnarsson," she replied without hesitation, then paused, confusion clouding her features. Though sometimes I feel as if that's not quite right, as if there's something more, something I'm forgetting. The name carried weight in these lands. The Gunnarsson line had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure, their holdings spanning vast territories before political upheavals had scattered the family to distant shores or early graves. If Astrid truly carried that blood, her presence here was far from coincidental. Hakon rose and walked to the window, his trained gaze sweeping the tree line for signs of movement. The forest held its breath in the way it did when predators lurked just beyond sight. His hand rested casually on the pommel of his sword, a blade that had earned its reputation in battles from the Shetland Isles to the banks of the Volga. "The men who came this morning," he said, his back still turned to her. "You're certain they weren't true temple guards?" The question seemed to break something loose in Astrid's mind, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Her breathing quickened, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of terrible certainty. They wore the symbols, carried the proper banners, but their leader, Bjorn the Ruthless, I knew his face. He was there when they came for my uncle 3 winters past. They claimed he had violated sacred law, but my father knew it was because he had spoken against their interpretation of the old texts. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that Hakon found all too familiar. Religious authority had always been a convenient mask for political ambition, and there were those who would use sacred law to settle very secular scores. The old ways were changing, and some sought to control that change to their advantage. "Your uncle," Hakon said, turning back to face her. "What became of him?" "He disappeared one night. His body was found weeks later in a bog, bearing wounds that suggested he had fought bravely before the end." Astrid's voice grew stronger as the memories crystallized. "My father swore then that our family would seek justice, that we would not let such crimes hide behind sacred symbols." The warrior nodded grimly. Blood feuds were as much a part of Norse life as the changing seasons, but when they became entangled with religious authority, the consequences could shake entire kingdoms. Honor demanded satisfaction, but wisdom counseled caution when dealing with those who claimed to speak for the gods themselves. A sound from the forest, the soft snap of a branch under a careful foot, brought Hakon to immediate alertness. His hand closed around his sword hilt as his eyes tracked movement between the trees. Years of warfare had taught him to trust his instincts, and every sense now screamed of approaching danger. "They're coming back," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of a man who had faced death so often it had become an old acquaintance. "How many did you see this morning?" Astrid's face paled, but her voice remained steady. 8 men, well armed. Their leader spoke of sacred law, but his eyes held nothing holy. The giant warrior positioned himself between Astrid and the door, his massive frame filling the space like a mountain settling into place. His sword whispered from its sheath, the familiar weight of the weapon bringing the comfort that only comes from absolute trust in one's tools. "Listen carefully," Hakon said, his tone gentle but urgent. "There's a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor. When the fighting begins, you'll go there and remain silent no matter what you hear above. Do you understand?" But Astrid shook her head, her chin lifting with a stubbornness that spoke of noble breeding and ingrained courage. "This is my family's home. These men have already taken too much from me. I won't hide while others fight my battles." Hakon might have smiled at her spirit under different circumstances. Instead, he simply nodded, recognizing in her defiance the same fierce pride that had driven her family to stand against corruption, even when it cost them everything. The sound of approaching horses grew clearer now, accompanied by the soft jingle of mail and weapons. Through the window, Hakon counted the shapes emerging from the morning mist. 9 men this time, 1 more than before. They had brought reinforcements, which suggested they took the giant warrior's presence seriously. "Your pendant," Hakon said suddenly, noticing how Astrid's fingers worked over the silver ravens. "Where did it come from?" "My grandmother gave it to me when I reached womanhood. She said it had been in our family for generations, passed down through the women as a symbol of our heritage. Astrid's voice carried a note of puzzlement. She also said it would protect me when the time came to stand for what was right. The warriors were dismounting now, their movements coordinated and professional. These weren't simple bandits or religious zealots. They moved with the precision of men trained for war. Their leader, a man with graying hair and calculating eyes, gestured to his companions as they spread out to surround the homestead. "Astrid Gunnarsson," the leader called out, his voice carrying the false authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You will come with us to answer for your crimes against the sacred order. Surrender now, and your death will be swift." Hakon stepped into the doorway, his presence alone causing several of the men to take an unconscious step backward. When he spoke, his voice carried across the clearing with the quiet power of distant thunder. "I am Hakon Arvidson, called the Mountain of the North. This woman is under my protection. Any who would harm her must first prove their worth against my blade." The leader's eyes narrowed as he took in the giant warrior's reputation made flesh. Bjorn the Ruthless had not earned his name through mercy, but neither had he survived this long by accepting unnecessary challenges from legendary fighters. "Stand aside, Mountain. This matter doesn't concern you. The woman has violated sacred law, and justice must be served." "Justice," Hakon repeated, the word carrying subtle mockery. "Is that what you call the murder of innocents? I've seen your kind of justice before, Bjorn. It leaves families dead and truth buried beneath convenient lies." The tension in the clearing stretched taut as a bowstring as both sides measured their chances. Astrid stood behind Hakon, her hand still clutching the silver pendant, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a heavy cloak. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the truth that could no longer be hidden. This was no simple matter of religious law, but a deadly game played by men who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The first arrow whistled past Hakon's ear, embedding itself in the doorframe with a solid thunk that spoke of powerful bows and skilled archers. The giant warrior moved with surprising speed for his size, pulling Astrid behind the thick timber wall as more shafts peppered the homestead's exterior. "So much for sacred law and proper justice," Hakon muttered, his sword singing as he tested its balance. "Nothing sacred about arrows in the back." Bjorn's voice carried across the clearing with cold authority. "Burn them out. The woman's crimes warrant any means necessary to bring her to judgment." Through the window, Hakon watched as two of the men moved toward the homestead carrying bundles of dried brush and pitch-soaked cloth. These weren't temple guards seeking to arrest a criminal. They were assassins intent on leaving no witnesses to their deeds. Astrid pressed herself against the wall, her breathing rapid but controlled. "My mother's loom," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the corner where a half-finished tapestry stretched between wooden frames. She was weaving the story of our lineage, the true history of our family. "If they burn the house, the truth dies with us," Hakon finished grimly. He understood now why they had come in force. This wasn't about sacred relics or religious law. Someone wanted the Gunnarsson family history erased entirely, and they were willing to commit any atrocity to achieve that end. The warrior's mind raced through tactical options as smoke began to seep under the door. The homestead was well built, but not a fortress. 9 armed men against one, even one with his reputation, made for poor odds. But Hakon Arvidson hadn't earned his fearsome name by accepting defeat when the numbers looked grim. "The root cellar," he said urgently. "Is there another way out?" Astrid nodded, her noble composure cracking slightly as the reality of their situation settled over her. "A tunnel that leads to the old well behind the house. My grandfather dug it during the border wars, in case raiders came." "Good. Take whatever you can carry of your mother's work and go. I'll hold them here as long as possible." But Astrid shook her head with fierce determination. "I told you I won't hide while others fight my battles. Besides, you don't know the tunnel's path. You'd be lost in the dark while they hunt us both." A burning arrow shattered the window shutters, scattering embers across the wooden floor. The smell of smoke grew thicker, and Hakon could hear the crackling of flames taking hold on the roof thatch above. "Then we go together," he decided, grabbing a water bucket to douse the spreading flames. "But first, I mean to make them pay for their arrogance." The giant warrior moved to the door and lifted the heavy bar that secured it. His battle-hardened instincts read the movements outside like a hunter tracking prey. 2 men approaching the front, 3 more circling toward the back, the rest maintaining positions with bows ready. "When I go out, you run for the cellar," Hakon commanded. "Don't look back, don't hesitate. Get to that tunnel and be ready to guide us both if I make it through." Astrid caught his arm as he prepared to charge into the clearing. "The pendant," she said urgently, pressing the silver ravens into his palm. "My grandmother said it would protect those who fought for justice." "Take it." Hakon looked down at the intricate metalwork, feeling the weight of generations in its crafted curves. "This belongs to your family line, not to an aging warrior." "My family line stands to end today if we don't survive this," she replied with quiet intensity. "Honor my grandmother's words. Let it guard you as you guard me." The warrior slipped the pendant over his head, feeling the silver settle against his chest with surprising warmth. Then he kicked open the door and exploded into the clearing like a force of nature unleashed. The first man never saw the blow coming. Hakon's sword took him through the chest before he could raise his weapon, the blade sliding between ribs with the terrible precision of long experience. The giant spun immediately toward the second attacker, his momentum carrying him forward as steel rang against steel. "Mountain, behind you!" Astrid's warning cry came just in time for Hakon to duck under a spear thrust aimed at his neck. He rolled left and came up swinging, his blade opening the spearman's throat in a crimson arc that painted the morning air. 3 down, 6 remaining. The archers were repositioning now, seeking clear shots while their leader screamed orders from his position near the tree line. Hakon used the homestead's bulk as cover, forcing them to come to him rather than allowing them to use their ranged advantage. Smoke poured from the roof now, and flames licked at the shutters. Astrid had vanished into the house, hopefully making her way to the cellar and the escape tunnel beyond. Everything depended on buying her enough time to reach safety and prepare their route. 2 warriors rushed him together, their coordinated attacks speaking of shared training and mutual trust. Hakon gave ground deliberately, drawing them away from the house while his sword wove patterns of death in the air between them. One stumbled over his fallen companion's body, and the giant's blade found his heart. The second managed to score a shallow cut across Hakon's shoulder before losing his head to a backswing that carried all the mountain's legendary strength. Enough. Bjorn stepped forward, his own sword drawn and ready. "I'll finish this mountain myself and be done with it." The leader was skilled, Hakon recognized immediately. His stance spoke of formal training and real experience, not the crude brutality of common soldiers. When he attacked, his blade moved with calculated precision, seeking to exploit the reach advantage of his longer weapon. But Hakon Arvidson had faced skilled opponents before, and he had learned long ago that reputation could be as deadly as any sword. He fought with the controlled fury that had made him legend, each strike carrying the weight of accumulated battles and the wisdom of survived wars. Steel rang against steel as they circled each other in the smoke-filled clearing. Bjorn was fast and clever, but Hakon was experience made flesh, every movement flowing from lessons written in the blood of fallen enemies. When the leader overextended on a thrust aimed at the giant's heart, Hakon's riposte opened his sword arm to the bone. Bjorn stumbled backward, his weapon falling from nerveless fingers as blood poured down his arm. "You don't understand," he gasped, pressing, his remaining hand against the wound. "The girl carries knowledge that could destroy kingdoms. We serve a higher purpose than your simple honor." "Higher purpose," Hakon repeated, his sword point resting against the man's throat. "Is that what you called it when you murdered her family, when you slaughtered innocents to protect your secrets?" The Gunnarsson line carries memories of the old compact, the true agreements made when the kingdoms were young. If those truths emerge now, they could shatter the carefully built order we've worked generations to establish. The pendant grew warm against Hakon's chest as understanding dawned. This wasn't about religious law or even political ambition. This was about the very foundations of power in the northern kingdoms, about promises made and broken in the dim mists of history. "What compact?" he demanded, his blade drawing a thin line of blood from Bjorn's neck. But before the wounded leader could answer, a crossbow bolt sprouted from his chest, fired by one of his own men from the tree line. The message was clear. Even their own leader's life was worthless compared to the secrets they protected. The remaining archers were already melting back into the forest, their mission accomplished even in failure. They had confirmed that Astrid still lived and carried her family's knowledge. Now they would return to their masters with news that would bring greater forces to bear. Hakon grabbed Bjorn's body and dragged it toward the burning homestead, seeking answers from the dying man's possessions. In the leader's belt pouch, he found a sealed letter bearing the mark of a raven, not the intertwined design of Astrid's pendant, but a single bird perched on a crown. The homestead was fully ablaze now, generations of Gunnarsson history turning to ash and smoke. Hakon stuffed the letter inside his tunic and ran for the house, praying that Astrid had found the tunnel and that it would lead them both to safety. Behind him, the flames roared higher, consuming not just wood and thatch, but the last visible remnants of a family's legacy. Whatever secrets the Gunnarsson line carried, they now lived only in the memory of a confused young woman and the protection of a giant warrior who was beginning to understand that he had stepped into a conflict far larger and more dangerous than a simple rescue. The tunnel stretched into darkness like the gullet of some ancient beast, its earthen walls shored up with timber that had aged to the color of old bone. Hakon followed Astrid's sure footsteps through the narrow passage, his massive frame barely fitting through spaces designed for smaller men in desperate times. Behind them, the orange glow of the burning homestead painted the tunnel entrance in hellish light. The smell of smoke mixed with the dank odor of earth and roots, creating an atmosphere that felt like descending into the realm of the dead. Each step carried them further from the familiar world above and deeper into uncertainties that seemed to multiply with every yard of darkness. "Here," Astrid whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "The passage turns left toward the old well. My grandfather told stories of hiding here while raiders burned our lands above." Hakon's hand rested on the sealed letter he had taken from Bjorn's body, its parchment crackling softly against his ribs with each movement. The raven seal, a single bird perched on a crown, burned in his mind like a brand. He had seen similar markings before, in the courts of ambitious jarls who spoke of unifying the scattered kingdoms under one rule. The ancient wooden box that Astrid carried pressed against her side, its iron bindings cold even through the cloth wrapping. She had grabbed it from beneath her mother's loom during those desperate moments when the homestead burned above them. Now it seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if the memories it contained were physical weights dragging at her strength. "Tell me about the compact," Hakon said quietly as they reached a wider section of tunnel where crude stone benches offered rest for desperate refugees. "Your uncle, your father, what did they know that was worth killing for?" Astrid set down the wooden box and ran her fingers along its carved surface, tracing symbols that seemed familiar yet remained frustratingly beyond her full understanding. "My grandmother spoke of it in whispers, always when my parents thought I wasn't listening. She said our family were keepers of the original agreements, the true word spoken when the first kings divided the northern lands." "Agreements can be rewritten," Hakon observed, settling his bulk carefully on one of the stone seats. "Promises can be broken or forgotten. Why would anyone fear words spoken generations ago?" "Because they weren't just words," Astrid replied, her voice growing stronger as memories crystallized in the darkness. "They were witnessed by the gods themselves, spoken in the old sacred places where oath-breaking meant not just dishonor, but divine curse. The compact established which bloodlines could rightfully rule, which lands belonged to which families, and what price would be paid for breaking the ancient bonds. The warrior's weathered features hardened with understanding. Divine witness made everything different in the world of Norse law. An oath sworn before the gods couldn't simply be set aside for political convenience. It required either perfect fulfillment or acceptance of supernatural consequences that could extend through generations. "Someone wants to break the compact," he said grimly. "Someone with enough power to kill entire families to silence the keepers of the original words." Astrid opened the wooden box with trembling fingers, revealing carefully preserved scrolls and tablets covered in runes that seemed to dance in the dim light filtering down from the well above. My mother was teaching me to read these, to understand our family's role as guardians of the ancient truths. She said the time would come when I would need to speak the words that our bloodline has protected for centuries. Hakon leaned closer, studying the intricate rune work that covered the ancient materials. His education had been that of a warrior, not a scholar, but years of service in various courts had exposed him to enough royal documents to recognize the formal language of binding treaties. "Can you read them now?" he asked. "Some," Astrid admitted, her finger tracing lines of carved symbols. "This speaks of 7 bloodlines, each granted dominion over specific territories in exchange for eternal service to the old ways. The compact bound them together in alliance and forbade any from claiming sovereignty over the others without consent of all 7 houses." The implications struck Hakon like a physical blow. If the ancient compact was still binding under divine law, then any attempt to unite the kingdoms by force would require either the consent of all 7 bloodlines or the elimination of those who could speak against such unification. "How many of the 7 lines still survive?" he asked, though he suspected the answer would be troubling. Astrid's face paled as understanding dawned. "My family were the Gunnarsson line. Uncle Eric represented the Thorson house before his murder. I've heard rumors of other families meeting mysterious ends over the past few years, always with explanations that seemed convenient for those who inherited their lands." "Someone is clearing the board," Hakon concluded grimly. "Removing the ancient obstacles to absolute power, but they need to do it carefully, with justifications that don't appear to violate the old laws." The letter crinkled again as the giant warrior shifted position, reminding him of the mystery that had died with Bjorn. The single raven perched on a crown, a symbol that suggested someone was already claiming the authority that the compact would deny them. "We need to reach safety," he said, rising from the stone bench. "Somewhere you can study these documents fully and we can plan our next move. Do you have allies among the remaining bloodlines?" Astrid carefully rewrapped the precious scrolls and tablets, her movements reverent as someone handling sacred relics. "The Eriksson line still maintains their seat in the eastern fjords. Jarl Magnus would remember the old obligations to my family, but the journey is dangerous, especially if we're being hunted." "Everything is dangerous now," Hakon replied matter-of-factly. "The question is whether we run from the danger or face it on ground of our choosing." Above them, the sound of hoofbeats echoed down through the well shaft. Riders moving fast along the forest paths. Too many horses for casual travelers, moving with the urgency of men on deadly business. "They're organizing the hunt," the warrior observed, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. "Word of what happened. Here will bring more enemies than we can handle in open combat." Astrid shouldered the precious box with determination that reminded Hakon of her noble heritage. "Then we don't fight in the open. We use the old paths, the hidden ways my grandfather taught our family. There are allies who still remember their oaths, even if they fear to speak them openly." The tunnel stretched onward into deeper darkness, promising both escape and greater dangers beyond. Behind them, the flames consuming her family's homestead cast dancing shadows that seemed like ghosts of all who had died to protect the ancient secrets. "The pendant," Astrid said suddenly, noticing how the silver raven seemed to gleam against Hakon's chest even in the dim light. It's grown warm again. My grandmother said it would guide the worthy to safety when the old compact was threatened. Hakon touched the artifact, feeling heat that had nothing to do with his body's warmth. Whether the sensation came from divine intervention or simple coincidence, it offered a direction in their desperate flight, forward into the unknown rather than backward toward certain death. The sound of pursuit grew fainter as they moved deeper into the earth, following passages carved by desperate hands in desperate times. Whatever lay ahead could hardly be worse than the enemies gathering behind them. The ancient box of secrets promised answers if they could survive long enough to seek them. The ancient well shaft opened above them like a window to the world of the living, its stone-lined walls worn smooth by countless hands seeking water in simpler times. Hakon boosted Astrid up first, her slight frame making the climb manageable despite the precious box strapped across her shoulders. The giant warrior followed with considerably more difficulty, his massive form scraping against the stones as he hauled himself toward the circle of grey sky above. They emerged into a copse of birch trees whose white bark glowed like bone in the morning light. The homestead was invisible from here, though smoke still rose in the distance like a funeral pyre for all the Gunnarsson family had built across the generations. The sound of searching riders echoed from multiple directions, suggesting their enemies had spread wide to prevent escape. "Which way to your allies?" Hakon asked quietly, his experienced eyes reading the landscape for defensive positions and escape routes. Years of warfare had taught him to see terrain as either advantage or liability, and this open ground offered little comfort for fugitives. Astrid consulted a mental map inherited from childhood explorations and family stories. The Eriksson holdings are 3 days north by the main road, but there are older paths through the high country. Shepherd tracks and hunters' ways that few remember now. The old paths will be safer, the warrior agreed, but also slower and will need supplies. Food, warm clothing, materials to tend wounds. He gestured to the cut on his shoulder, which had reopened during their tunnel escape and now stained his tunic with fresh blood. The runic compass that Astrid pulled from the wooden box seemed to pulse with its own inner light, its ancient bronze surface inscribed with symbols that predated the coming of the White Christ to these lands. The needle quivered uncertainly before settling on a direction that led neither toward the main roads nor the obvious mountain passes. "My grandfather's compass," she explained, noting Hakon's puzzled expression. "It doesn't point to magnetic north like the new instruments. It seeks the sacred sites, the old places where the gods still listen to mortal words." "And you think the gods will help us now?" he asked, not mockingly, but with the respectful skepticism of a man who had seen too much suffering to trust in easy divine intervention. Astrid traced the compass's ancient markings with her fingertip, feeling the weight of generations of faith behind the simple device. "My grandmother believed they would help those who defended the old compact. The agreement wasn't just between mortal kings. It was witnessed by Odin himself at the sacred grove of Alfheim." The name carried power that made even the practical warrior pause. Alfheim was legend made real, one of the few remaining groves where the ancient rituals could still be performed with full authority. If the compact had truly been sworn there, it carried weight that no earthly king could simply set aside. A hunting horn sounded from the direction of the burned homestead, its deep note carrying clearly across the forest. The sound was answered from 3 different directions, creating a web of pursuit that was steadily tightening around their position. "They're organized," Hakon observed grimly. "Professional hunters, not just hired swords. Someone with real resources wants us dead." Astrid shouldered the box again and set off in the direction the runic compass indicated, her steps sure despite the rough terrain. "Then we'd better move like our lives depend on it, because they do." The path they followed was barely visible, more suggestion than reality, as it wound between ancient stones and gnarled trees that had stood since before the first kings claimed these lands. Hakon found himself impressed by the young woman's woodcraft. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the forest's secrets from childhood. "Tell me about the other bloodlines," he said as they climbed toward higher ground. "The ones who might still be alive to contest what's happening." Astrid paused to consult the compass again, then adjusted their course slightly eastward. "The Eriksson line I mentioned controls the eastern fjords, but they've grown cautious over the years. Too many of their allies have met unfortunate ends for Jarl Magnus to take unnecessary risks. Cautious is smart when assassins hunt bloodlines," Hakon noted. "What about the others?" "The Olafsson house once held the northern reaches, but their last heir died in a hunting accident 2 winters past. Very convenient for those who coveted his lands." Her voice carried bitter understanding of how political murders were disguised as misfortune. The compass needle swung again as they reached a ridge overlooking a valley dotted with standing stones. The ancient markers formed patterns that spoke of sacred geometry and ritual purposes that had been old when the current kingdoms were young. The Haraldsson line still maintains their seat in the Western Islands, though they've withdrawn from mainland politics. The Ivarsson house? Astrid's voice trailed off as painful memory surfaced. "What of them?" Hakon prompted gently. "They were wiped out last year. Pirates, the official reports claimed. Every man, woman, and child, killed in a raid that left no survivors to tell different stories." The pattern was becoming clear as mountain peaks emerging from morning mist. 7 bloodlines bound by divine compact, and only 3 possibly remaining alive, if the Gunnarsson line could be counted now that Astrid alone survived to carry their legacy. "That leaves your family, the Erikssons and the Haraldssons," the warrior calculated grimly. "Not enough to maintain the compact even if they all stood together." "There's one more," Astrid said quietly, her eyes fixed on the distant standing stones. "The Ragnarsson line, but they disappeared from written records generations ago. Some say they fell to internal strife. Others whisper they went into hiding to preserve ancient knowledge too dangerous for the modern world." A new sound reached them from behind. Dogs baying on a scent trail. Their pursuers had found skilled trackers, probably men who hunted both beast and human with equal efficiency. The hunt was becoming more sophisticated and more deadly with each passing hour. "The stones," Hakon said, pointing toward the ancient markers in the valley below. "Could they offer sanctuary?" Astrid consulted her compass one final time, watching as the needle swung decisively toward the sacred site. If the old laws still hold, violence committed in such places brings divine curse upon the perpetrators, but I don't know if our enemies still fear the god's anger. "Then we're about to find out," the giant warrior replied, checking his weapons one final time before they began their descent toward whatever protection or doom awaited among the standing stones of the ancestors. The standing stones loomed against the darkening sky like silent sentinels from a forgotten age, their weathered surfaces carved with runes that seemed to shift and dance in the twilight. 13 monoliths formed a perfect circle around a central altar stone, each one reaching toward the heavens with the determination of ancient faith made manifest in granite and time. Hakon felt the weight of ages pressing down upon him as they entered the sacred grove. The very air seemed thicker here, charged with the memory of countless rituals and the echo of oaths sworn when the world was young. His warrior's instincts, honed by decades of battle, whispered warnings about places where the old powers still held sway. The bone knife that Astrid withdrew from the wooden box caught the last rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Its blade was carved from what appeared to be whalebone, yellowed with age and inscribed with symbols that predated even the oldest runes they had seen. The handle was wrapped in leather so ancient it had taken on the texture of stone. "This was my grandmother's," she said quietly, her voice carrying the reverence reserved for sacred objects. She used it only for the most important rituals, the ones that required blood sacrifice to seal the connection between mortal and divine. The giant warrior studied the ancient blade with respect, born of understanding its significance. In the old ways, blood given freely carried power that mere words could never match. It was the difference between asking for divine favor and demanding it through proper sacrifice and invocation. "What ritual?" he asked, though something in the compass's behavior and Astrid's growing certainty suggested he already knew the answer. "The summoning of witness," she replied, setting down the wooden box at the base of the central altar stone. "If the compact was truly sworn here with divine witness, then that witness can be called again to testify to its binding nature." The sound of approaching horses grew closer, accompanied by the excited baying of hunting dogs that had found their quarry's scent. Through gaps in the stone circle, Hakon could see torches bobbing between the trees as their pursuers closed in on the sacred site. "How long does such a summoning take?" he asked practically, his hand resting on his sword hilt. Astrid began arranging the ancient scrolls around the altar stone in patterns dictated by traditions older than memory. "My grandmother said the gods answer quickly when the need is genuine and the cause is just, but they also test the petitioner's resolve before granting their aid." The first riders emerged from the forest at full gallop, their leader bearing a banner that displayed the single raven perched on a crown, the same symbol Hakon had found on Bjorn's sealed letter. These weren't random mercenaries or temple guards. They served someone with legitimate claims to royal authority, someone who needed the ancient compact eliminated to make those claims absolute. "Astrid Gunnarsson," the leader's voice carried across the grove with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "You will surrender the ancient documents and submit to royal justice. Your family's treason ends here." Hakon stepped between the riders and the sacred stones, his massive presence causing several horses to shy nervously. "Royal justice," he called back mockingly. "Since when does royal justice require burning innocents alive and murdering witnesses to prevent testimony?" The leader spurred his horse closer, but stopped just outside the stone circle, his mount refusing to cross the invisible boundary that marked sacred ground. "I am Commander Olaf, speaking with the authority of King Sigurd himself. The woman carries stolen documents that threaten the stability of the realm." "King Sigurd?" Hakon repeated thoughtfully. Interesting title for someone who was merely Jarl of the northern reaches when last I heard his name. "Tell me, Commander, how did your master acquire such lofty authority?" Behind him, Astrid's voice rose in the ancient words of invocation, her pronunciation careful and precise as she followed rituals passed down through generations of her bloodline. The bone knife gleamed as she drew it across her palm, letting her blood drip onto the altar stone where it seemed to sizzle with unnatural heat. "The northern kingdoms united willingly under King Sigurd's leadership," Commander Olav declared, though his tone suggested he knew the claim would convince no one present. "The old ways of division and conflict have given way to order and prosperity." "United by fear and murder, you mean?" Hakon countered. How many bloodlines had to be eliminated before this miraculous unity emerged? How many families died to clear Sigurd's path to absolute power? The commander's hand moved to his sword hilt, but his horse still refused to enter the sacred circle. Around the grove's perimeter, more riders gathered, at least 20 now, all bearing the raven-crowned banner and all maintaining careful distance from the standing stones. "The old compact is void," Olav declared with forced conviction. "The divine witnesses are dead, the sacred sites abandoned. King Sigurd rules by right of conquest and the consent of his people." Astrid's voice reached a crescendo as ancient words of power echoed between the monoliths. The runes carved into each stone began to glow with pale blue light that seemed to emerge from within the granite itself. The very air around the altar stone shimmered like heat waves rising from sun-warmed earth. "If the witnesses are truly dead," Hakon called out, his voice carrying clearly over Astrid's chanting, "then you have nothing to fear from an ancient ritual performed by a desperate woman. Why not ride away and let the gods prove you right?" But even as he spoke, the giant warrior could feel the truth settling around them like morning mist. The old powers were not dead. They had merely been sleeping, waiting for someone with the proper bloodline and knowledge to wake them from their long slumber. Thunder rumbled overhead despite the clear evening sky, and the horses outside the circle began to prance nervously as their riders fought to maintain control. Whatever Astrid was summoning, it was old enough and powerful enough to make even well-trained war horses remember the primal fears of their distant ancestors. The bone knife completed its work as Astrid pressed her bleeding palm against the central rune carved into the altar stone. Light exploded upward from the ancient marking, reaching toward the heavens like a pillar of divine fire that announced to all the worlds that sacred law was being invoked by its rightful guardian. Commander Olav shouted orders to his men, but their horses refused to advance against the growing supernatural presence that filled the grove with power not seen in the mortal realm for generations uncounted. The divine presence manifested not as blinding light or thunderous voice, but as a subtle shift in reality that made the very air dense with ancient authority. The trees surrounding the sacred grove leaned inward as if bowing before power that predated their oldest rings, and the stones themselves hummed with harmonics that resonated in the bones of all who stood within their circle. Hakon felt the silver pendant grow warm against his chest, its twin ravens seeming to pulse with life as divine attention focused upon the sacred site. Years of warfare had taught him to recognize supernatural intervention when it occurred, and this carried the unmistakable weight of gods taking interest in mortal affairs. A figure began to coalesce in the space above the altar stone. Not solid flesh, but something more substantial than mere spirit. The form wore the grey robes and wide-brimmed hat of the wanderer, and a single eye gleamed with wisdom accumulated through eons of observation. 2 ravens perched upon his shoulders, their dark eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain all the secrets ever whispered in shadow. Astrid of the Gunnarsson line, the divine witness spoke, his voice carrying the authority of one who had shaped the world through word and deed. You call upon ancient compacts sworn in my presence. State your claim and present your evidence. The young woman knelt before the manifestation, her noble bearing undiminished even in the presence of divinity. All-Father, I claim the protection promised to the 7 bloodlines when the Northern Compact was forged. King Sigurd breaks sacred law by eliminating the Keeper families and seizing power reserved for joint governance. The war tablet that she lifted from the wooden box seemed to catch and amplify the divine light surrounding them. Its surface was covered with runic script that glowed like molten gold, detailing not just the original compact, but the specific penalties for violating its terms. Each symbol pulsed with the memory of divine witness and the weight of oaths that could not be broken without consequence. Behold the original terms, Astrid continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she attempted. 7 bloodlines granted dominion over their ancestral lands in exchange for eternal vigilance against the return of ancient evils. No single line may claim sovereignty over the others without unanimous consent of all 7 houses. Commander, Olav urged his mount closer to the stone circle's edge, his face pale but his voice defiant. The compact is void. The bloodlines failed in their duties. They allowed division and weakness to flourish while external threats grew strong. King Sigurd united the fractured kingdoms through strength and wisdom. The divine witness turned his single eye toward the commander, and the mortal man's horse shied backward as if struck by invisible force. Speak you for one who claims to break oaths sworn in my presence, mortal. Do you understand the weight of such accusations? Hakon stepped forward, feeling the pendant's warmth spread through his chest like liquid courage. All-Father, I've seen the evidence of Sigurd's methods. Entire families murdered in the night, their deaths disguised as accidents or blamed on bandits and raiders. This is not unity through strength. It is conquest through treachery. The war tablet revealed its contents as Astrid spread it fully upon the altar stone. The runic script detailed not just the compact's terms, but the specific bloodlines bound by its authority and the exact consequences for violation. Most chilling of all were the final passages, which spoke of ancient evils that would return if the protective compact was ever broken through treachery. The Ragnarsson line, the divine witness said, his ravens shifting restlessly upon his shoulders. What news of their stewardship? Astrid's voice trembled with uncertainty. They vanished from the records generations ago, my lord. Some say they fell to internal strife. Others believe they went into hiding to preserve knowledge too dangerous for common keeping. Thunder rolled across the clear sky as the All-Father's attention focused beyond the immediate gathering. They live still, though hidden from mortal sight. Their vigil continues in the deep places where the first evils are bound. But their strength wanes without the support promised by the compact. The implications struck Hakon like a physical blow. The compact wasn't just about political governance, it was about maintaining supernatural barriers that protected the mortal realm from threats beyond normal understanding. If Sigurd's ambition weakened those protections, the consequences could extend far beyond simple tyranny. Commander Olav drew his sword despite his mount's continued refusal to approach the sacred stones. Divine witness or not, this woman carries stolen documents and spreads lies that threaten the realm's stability. King Sigurd's authority is recognized by the Church and accepted by his people. Authority granted by mortal institutions. The divine presence replied with ominous calm. But what of oaths sworn before higher powers? What of promises sealed with blood and witnessed by eternity itself? The war tablet began to emit a low harmonic tone that resonated with the standing stones themselves. One by one, the monoliths responded with their own frequencies until the entire grove vibrated with sound that existed beyond normal hearing, music that spoke directly to the soul and carried the weight of absolute truth. The compact holds, the All-Father declared, his voice cutting through the supernatural harmony. The bloodlines remain bound by their oaths, and protection is extended to those who maintain their sacred duties. But choice must be made. Will the survivors unite to restore the proper order, or will they allow ambition to shatter barriers maintained through sacrifice and vigilance? Astrid clutched the war tablet to her chest as understanding crystallized in her mind. The eastern fjords, Jarl Magnus of the Eriksson line, if we can reach him with proof of divine support. He will either stand with ancient law or reveal himself as another who has forgotten the true price of peace, Hakon finished grimly. The pendant seemed to burn against his skin now, as if the divine presence was marking him for some purpose beyond simple protection. The manifestation began to fade as the ritual reached its natural conclusion, but the All-Father's final words carried clearly across the grove. The compact endures, but only while its guardians remember their duty. Fail in this, and the darkness kept at bay will return to reclaim what was once its domain. Commander Olav shouted orders to his men as the divine presence dissipated, but their horses remained skittish and unwilling to approach the still glowing stones. The supernatural intervention had ended, but its effects would linger in the minds of all who witnessed divine law proclaimed over mortal ambition. The war tablet's golden glow gradually faded to normal parchment, but the words inscribed upon its surface remained as clear as if freshly carved. Whatever happened next, they now carried proof that would convince any who still honored the old ways, if they could survive long enough to present it. The journey to the eastern fjords took 2 days through mountain passes that seemed designed by the gods themselves to test mortal determination. Hakon and Astrid moved like shadows between the peaks, following paths known only to smugglers and outlaws who valued secrecy above comfort. Behind them, the pursuit had grown to include royal troops bearing Sigurd's banner alongside the original hunters. The crown seal that Astrid discovered in the deepest compartment of the wooden box changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Hidden beneath false backing, wrapped in silk that had somehow preserved its crimson color through generations of careful storage, lay an artifact that made her blood run cold with recognition. "This belonged to King Harald Fairhair," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind howling through the mountain pass. "The first king to unite the Norwegian territories under single rule. My grandmother told stories of how it was lost when his dynasty fell to internal strife and foreign invasion." Hakon examined the golden seal with eyes that had seen enough royal regalia to recognize authentic craftsmanship. The device bore not just Harold's personal mark, but symbols of divine authority that predated Christian influence in these lands. Most unsettling of all was the inscription around its edge, runes that proclaimed the bearer as rightful ruler over all northern territories. "If this is genuine," the giant warrior said carefully, "then whoever possesses it could claim legitimate authority over Sigurd's entire kingdom. The question becomes whether your family were thieves who stole it or guardians who preserved it for the rightful heir." The truth struck Astrid with the force of divine revelation as memories locked away by trauma suddenly crystallized in her mind. "We weren't just keepers of the compact, we were keepers of the crown itself. My grandmother wasn't just teaching me family history, she was preparing me to recognize the true king when he finally returned." The implications reordered everything they thought they knew about the conspiracy against the bloodlines. Sigurd wasn't just eliminating political rivals. He was systematically hunting down anyone who could challenge his legitimacy by producing proof of a more ancient and valid claim to royal authority. "The Ragnarsson line," Hakon said with growing understanding. "They didn't disappear because of internal strife. They went into hiding because they carry the blood of Harald Fairhair himself. They're the rightful rulers that your family has been protecting evidence for." Astrid's hands trembled as she held the crown seal, feeling the weight of destiny pressing down upon her shoulders like a mountain settling into place. Everything her family had suffered, every death and disappearance among the 7 bloodlines, had been orchestrated to prevent this moment of recognition. A hunting horn echoed from the valley below, its deep note carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Their pursuers had found the trail again, and the sound suggested they had reinforcements. Too many riders to evade through cleverness alone. "There's something else," Astrid said urgently, her fingers tracing hidden catches in the wooden box that she had never noticed before. "My grandmother always said the box held 7 secrets, one for each bloodline. We've only found 3 artifacts so far." The hidden compartment that opened at her touch revealed a map unlike any Hakon had seen in his years of military service. Drawn on material that felt like silk but possessed the durability of leather, it depicted not just geographical features but locations marked with symbols that pulsed with their own faint light. "Sacred sites," she breathed, recognizing patterns that matched her grandmother's lessons about the old places of power. But not just any sites. These are marked as active, places where the barriers between worlds remain thin enough for the compact's protection to function. 7 locations glowed more brightly than the others, forming a pattern across the northern territories that suggested deliberate placement rather than random occurrence. Each was marked with runes, indicating which bloodline held responsibility for maintaining its spiritual defenses. "The Ragnarsson site," Hakon observed, pointing to a location marked in the far northern wastes beyond normal settlement. "It's not just glowing, it's pulsing, as if something there is awakening or calling for attention." The sound of approaching riders grew closer, accompanied by the excited baying of tracking dogs that had found their scent. Through gaps in the mountain peaks, they could see smoke rising from multiple campfires, evidence that their enemies had established bases throughout the region to coordinate the hunt. "We can't reach the eastern fjords," Astrid realized with growing desperation. "They've cut off every approach route. Jarl Magnus might as well be on the other side of the world." But Hakon studied the glowing map with the tactical mind of a veteran strategist, seeing possibilities that despair had hidden from Astrid's view. "Not the eastern fjords. But look, here. This northern site is only a day's hard travel from our current position. If the Ragnarsson line truly maintains their vigil there, you want to seek help from people who have been hiding for generations, who might not even exist anymore except in legend and wishful thinking." The giant warriors' weathered features set in lines of grim determination. I want to seek help from the rightful rulers of these lands, armed with proof that might convince them the time for hiding is past. That crown seal doesn't just represent ancient authority, it's a call to action that they've been waiting generations to receive. The magical map showed something else that neither had noticed at first, pathways of light connecting the 7 sacred sites, forming a network that pulsed with supernatural energy. As they watched, several of those connections began to dim and flicker, as if the destruction of the bloodlines was weakening the entire protective structure. The compact isn't just political, Astrid whispered with dawning horror. It's literally holding something back. Each bloodline maintains part of a barrier that keeps ancient evils from returning to the mortal realm. When families are murdered, their sections of the barrier begin to fail. Hakon felt the pendant grow warm against his chest as understanding crystallized. Sigurd isn't just seizing power for personal ambition. He's either ignorant of the supernatural consequences, or he's deliberately trying to weaken the barriers for some purpose we haven't discovered yet. The pursuit was close enough now that they could hear individual voices shouting orders and coordinating search patterns. Commander Olav's troops had proven both persistent and professional, qualities that made them formidable hunters in terrain that offered few places to hide. The northern site it is, Astrid decided, carefully rewrapping the crown seal and replacing it in the wooden box alongside the other artifacts. If the Ragnarsson line truly guards the most crucial barrier, they need to know what's happening to the other bloodlines. And if they're all dead, Hakon asked practically as they began their descent toward the treacherous paths that led north into the wastelands. Then we hold the barriers ourselves for as long as possible, she replied with determination that would have made her ancestors proud. My grandmother always said that duty doesn't end just because the task becomes impossible. The crown seal pulsed with faint warmth through the wooden box, as if the ancient artifact approved of their desperate choice. Whatever lay ahead in the northern wastes, they now carried proof that could reshape the political landscape of the entire region, if they could survive long enough to present it to those who still honored the old laws and older loyalties. The northern wastelands stretched before them like a frozen sea of stone and ice, where even the hardiest vegetation struggled to survive in the shadow of peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky itself. The air here carried a weight that had nothing to do with altitude, an oppressive presence that made both horse and rider move with unconscious wariness, as if approaching the domain of something ancient and watchful. The ritual hammer that Astrid found in the wooden box's final hidden compartment bore inscriptions that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly, their meaning clear only when glimpsed from the corner of the eye. The weapon was smaller than those carried by warriors, its head carved from what appeared to be meteoric iron that held patterns of light within its dark surface like captured starlight. This was never meant for battle, she said quietly, running her fingers along the hammer's inscribed handle. It's for breaking seals, for opening pathways that were meant to remain closed. My grandmother spoke of it only in whispers, as if the very words might awaken something better left sleeping. Hakon studied the artifact with growing unease. Years of warfare had exposed him to enough battlefield magic to recognize tools designed for purposes beyond mortal understanding. What manner of seals would require such a device? The kind that separate our world from older, darker realms, Astrid replied, her voice carrying the weight of inherited knowledge and growing fear. The barriers that the compact was designed to maintain. This hammer could open those pathways or strengthen them depending on the wielder's intent and knowledge. The sacred map glowed more brightly with each mile they traveled north, its interconnected lines pulsing like the veins of some vast, supernatural heart. 3 of the 7 connection points had gone completely dark now, their light extinguished with the destruction of the bloodlines that had maintained them. The remaining 4 flickered with increasing urgency, as if whatever they held back was testing the weakened barriers with growing boldness. Behind them, the pursuit had evolved from simple hunting to full military operation. Through his spyglass, Hakon counted at least 50 riders moving in coordinated formations, supported by supply wagons and what appeared to be siege equipment. Someone had decided that capturing them alive was less important than ensuring they could never reach their destination. "They know where we're going," he observed grimly, watching the disciplined advance of troops who moved with the precision of royal guard rather than hired mercenaries. "This isn't random pursuit anymore. They're driving us toward a specific confrontation." Astrid consulted the magical map one final time before tucking it safely inside her cloak. "The northern site isn't just a sacred grove or ancient altar. According to this, it's a fortress built around the most crucial barrier of all. It's the one that holds back what my grandmother called the first darkness." The very name seemed to make the mountain winds blow colder, carrying whispers of things that existed before light brought order to the void. Hakon felt the pendant grow heavy against his chest, its silver ravens seeming to shift restlessly, as if sensing the approach of ancient enemies they had been crafted to guard against. A new sound reached them from ahead, not the howl of wind through stone, but something that might have been singing if it hadn't carried notes that no human throat could produce. The melody rose and fell with harmonics that spoke of vast spaces and endless time, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. "We're close," Astrid whispered, recognizing the sound from her grandmother's most secret teachings. "That's the song of binding, the melody that helps maintain the barriers between worlds. But it's growing weaker. Some of the voices that should be singing are missing." The path ahead wound through a narrow canyon whose walls bore carvings that hurt to look at directly. The images seemed to depict battles between beings of light and entities of pure darkness, conflict that had raged before the first humans learned to make fire. At the canyon's end, a structure rose from the living rock itself, not built upon the mountain, but carved from it as if the entire peak had been shaped by divine will. The Ragnarsson stronghold existed on a scale that dwarfed human ambition, its towers and walls flowing seamlessly from the mountain's bones in patterns that suggested both fortress and temple. Windows glowed with warm light that spoke of life and purpose, while the structure's highest spire reached toward heaven like a finger pointing toward divine authority. How did they remain hidden for so long? Hakon wondered aloud, awed by the engineering feat before them. "Magic," Astrid replied simply. "The same power that maintains the barriers also conceals this, place from those who would misuse its secrets. But that concealment fails when the compact weakens. Another reason Sigurd's actions threaten more than simple political control." Figures appeared on the fortress walls as they approached, warriors in armor that gleamed like starlight, bearing weapons that hummed with contained power. These weren't ordinary guards, but something far older and more dangerous, protectors who had maintained their vigil through generations of secrecy and sacrifice. A horn sounded from the highest tower, its note carrying harmonies that seemed to resonate in the bones of the mountain itself. The melody wove through the song of binding, strengthening it momentarily before fading back to its previous weakened state. Riders approached the sacred threshold, a voice called down from the walls, speaking in a dialect so ancient that Astrid had to concentrate to understand the words. "State your lineage and your purpose in seeking the hidden kingdom." She held up the wooden box containing their precious artifacts, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a royal mantle. "I am Astrid of the Gunnarsson line, last keeper of the crown seal and guardian of the compact's sacred trust. I come bearing proof that the time for hiding has ended." The massive gates began to open with the sound of stone grinding against stone, revealing a courtyard where armed figures waited in formation. Their leader stepped forward, a man whose bearing spoke of royal blood and whose eyes held the depth of someone who had gazed into the abyss and chosen to stand guard against it. "I am Erik Ragnarsson," he declared, his voice carrying the authority of ancient kingship. "Son of Magnus, grandson of Harald, keeper of the deepest secrets and guardian of the final barrier. If you truly carry what you claim, then the hour we have long dreaded has finally arrived." Behind them, the sound of approaching armies grew louder as Sigurd's forces closed the distance to this hidden sanctuary. The final confrontation was approaching, between legitimate royal authority and usurped power, between ancient wisdom and modern ambition, between the forces that would preserve the barriers and those who would see them destroyed. Hakon felt the pendant burning against his chest as supernatural energies gathered like storm clouds around the mountain fortress. Whatever happened in the coming hours would determine not just the fate of kingdoms, but the very survival of the world they all knew. The ritual hammer seemed to pulse with its own dark energy as Astrid carried it toward the moment of decision, when the choice between opening and strengthening the barriers would determine whether ancient evils remained safely bound or burst forth to reclaim dominion over the mortal realm. The song of binding wavered and grew strong, like a heart struggling to maintain its rhythm in the face of mortal crisis. Soon, very soon, they would learn whether the old magic was strong enough to hold back the darkness that pressed against weakening walls, or whether the compact's failure would unleash horrors upon a world that had forgotten how to defend itself against such threats. Time was running out, and the final test of faith, courage, and ancient wisdom was about to begin in earnest. The great hall of the hidden fortress stretched into shadows that seemed to exist beyond normal space, its ceiling lost in darkness that hummed with ancient power. 7 thrones carved from single blocks of meteoric stone formed a circle around a central altar, where the song of binding emerged from crystal formations that resonated with supernatural harmony. Only 4 thrones showed signs of recent occupation. The others stood empty as monuments to bloodlines murdered in the service of ambition. Erik Ragnarsson moved with the measured grace of someone born to command, his weathered features bearing the weight of centuries of hidden kingship. The crown he wore was simple compared to the elaborate headpieces favored by modern rulers. A circlet of silver inscribed with runes of binding and protection that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "The compact weakens with each bloodline destroyed," he said solemnly, his eyes fixed on the sacred map that Astrid spread upon the central altar. "We have felt the barriers growing thin, heard the whispers of things that should remain silent pressing against the walls we maintain." Hakon studied the ancient chamber with a warrior's eye, noting defensive positions and escape routes while marveling at architecture that defied normal understanding. How long can the remaining barriers hold without the support of all 7 bloodlines? "Days. Perhaps a week if we pour all our strength into the bindings," Erik replied grimly. "But such effort would leave us defenseless against mortal enemies, and Sigurd's forces gather outside our sanctuary, like wolves scenting wounded prey." The crown seal of Harald Fairhair gleamed as Astrid lifted it from the wooden box, its golden surface catching and reflecting the strange light that filled the chamber. "This belongs to you by right of blood and succession. My family were merely guardians until the true king could safely claim his inheritance." Erik's eyes widened as he recognized the artifact, his composure finally cracking under the weight of seeing proof of his legitimacy after generations of hidden exile. "I'd begun to believe it was lost forever, another treasure buried with the bloodlines who died protecting it." "Not buried," Astrid corrected gently. "Preserved. My grandmother died believing this moment would come when the rightful king would need to choose between claiming his throne and maintaining the barriers that protect our world from ancient darkness." The ritual hammer seemed to grow heavier in her other hand as she contemplated the choice that lay before them all. The ancient weapon could strengthen the failing barriers, but only through sacrifice that would bind the remaining bloodlines to their posts for generations to come. Or it could be used to break the barriers entirely, unleashing the first darkness in the hope that mortal armies could somehow defeat what divine power had barely managed to contain. A tremendous crash echoed through the chamber as Sigurd's forces reached the outer gates. The sound of siege engines and battle cries carried clearly through stone walls that had stood inviolate for centuries, announcing that the final confrontation would brook no further delay. They've brought more than soldiers, Eric observed, his enhanced senses reading the supernatural disturbances that accompanied the assault. I sense practitioners of the dark arts, wielders of magic that draws its power from the very entities we guard against. The implication struck Hakon like a physical blow. Sigurd isn't ignorant of the barrier's purpose. He's deliberately working to weaken them, allied with the very forces the compact was designed to contain. Through the chamber's ancient windows, they could see torches and banners surrounding the mountain fortress in numbers that suggested a full royal army. But worse than the conventional forces were the figures that moved in the deeper shadows, shapes that seemed to bend light around themselves and whisper words that made the protective runes carved into the walls flicker with strain. The choice must be made now, Eric said with the calm authority of someone who had spent his lifetime preparing for this moment. We can use our remaining strength to reinforce the barriers, accepting imprisonment in this sanctuary until death claims us all. Or we can take the crown seal into the world and fight for the throne that might give us power to oppose Sigurd through conventional means. There's a third option, Astrid said quietly, the ritual hammer warm in her grip as understanding crystallized in her mind. The hammer wasn't just designed to break or strengthen barriers, it was created to transfer them, to move the binding points to new locations where they might be better defended. The song of binding wavered as enemy magic pressed against the chamber's protections, dark harmonies trying to corrupt the ancient melodies that held reality stable. Cracks appeared in the crystal formations that maintained the supernatural resonance, spreading like spider webs through structures that had stood firm since the world was young. Transfer the barriers to where? Hakon asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer from the way the pendant burned against his chest. To the sacred sites that still have guardians, she replied, her eyes bright with desperate hope. Concentrate the remaining power into 3 locations instead of 7, creating stronger barriers that might hold even without the support of the murdered bloodlines. Eric gripped the crown seal as the weight of ultimate decision settled upon his shoulders, knowing that whatever choice he made would echo through history and determine the fate of all who lived under northern skies. The ritual hammer blazed with inner fire as Astrid raised it above the central altar, its meteoric iron surface revealing patterns of starlight that spoke of power drawn from the heavens themselves. The ancient weapon responded to her touch with harmonics that joined and strengthened the faltering song of binding, adding new melodies that had been silent for generations. "Blood of the Guardians," Eric declared, drawing a ceremonial blade and cutting his palm to let royal blood drip upon the altar stone. "Power of the rightful king, to command the ancient bindings." Hakon felt the silver pendant burning against his chest as supernatural energies gathered around them like a storm preparing to break. Outside the chamber, the sounds of battle grew closer as Sigurd's forces breached the outer defenses and pressed inward toward the sanctuary where the final barrier held. The sacred map flared to brilliant life as Astrid brought the hammer down upon the altar with force that shook the mountain to its foundations. Light exploded outward from the impact, racing along the connections between sacred sites and gathering the failing power of the murdered bloodlines into streams of pure energy that could be redirected and concentrated. "Ericsson Holdings in the eastern fjords," she chanted, her voice joining the ancient rhythms as power flowed through her into the ritual focus. "Haraldsson Strongholds in the western islands. Ragnarsson Fortress in the northern wastes. 3 points of a triangle to hold what 7 circles once contained." The chamber filled with spirits of the dead, as the ghostly forms of murdered guardians appeared to lend their strength to the working. Astrid saw her mother and father standing among them, their faces proud and peaceful as they witnessed their daughter completing the duty they had died protecting. Eric gripped the crown seal tightly as authority flowed through him. Not just the right to rule, but the divine mandate to command forces that existed beyond mortal understanding. "By blood and binding, by oath and authority, I command the barriers to hold against the darkness that would consume our world." A tremendous roar shook the fortress as something vast and terrible pressed against the weakening protections from the other side of reality. The first darkness had sensed the ritual's power and was making one final assault before the barriers could be reinforced and relocated. "Hakon!" Astrid called out as shadowy tentacles began seeping through cracks in the chamber walls. "The pendant! It's not just protection, it's a focus for the binding energies. You have to help anchor the ritual while we complete the transfer." The giant warrior drew his sword and stepped between the emerging darkness and the sacred altar, the silver ravens on his chest blazing like twin suns as they channeled power through his mortal frame. Steel met shadow with sounds that existed beyond normal hearing, his blade somehow solid enough to cut entities that had no physical form. The ritual hammer rose and fell in precise rhythm as Astrid redirected the barrier network's power, each impact sending shockwaves through dimensions that mortal minds could barely comprehend. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she felt the weight of protecting an entire world settling upon her shoulders. "The doors are breaking," Eric warned, his enhanced senses tracking Sigurd's advance through the fortress levels. "Dark practitioners are with him. I can feel them corrupting the protective runes carved into the walls themselves." Commander Olaf's voice carried clearly from the corridor outside as royal troops prepared for final assault. "Surrender the usurper and the stolen documents. King Sigurd offers mercy to those who submit to lawful authority." "Lawful authority?" Hakon laughed grimly as his sword traced patterns of light through the attacking shadows. "Built on murder and alliance with the very entities he claims to protect his people from." The chamber doors exploded inward as Sigurd himself strode into the sanctuary, flanked by warriors in armor that seemed to absorb light and practitioners whose robes writhed with symbols that hurt to perceive directly. The self-proclaimed king bore a crown that parodied true royal authority, gold twisted into shapes that channeled power from darker sources. "Erik Ragnarsson," Sigurd declared with false majesty, his eyes fixed on the crown seal that blazed with legitimate authority. "You have hidden in shadows long enough. The old ways are dead, and the new order has no place for guardians of obsolete mysteries. The mysteries you would destroy are the only thing standing between civilization and chaos," Eric replied calmly, the true crown's silver light pushing back the darkness that surrounded his rival. "You serve powers that see humanity as cattle to be consumed, not subjects to be protected." Astrid brought the hammer down one final time as the barrier transfer reached its completion. Light exploded through the chamber as centuries of accumulated protective power relocated itself to the three remaining strongholds, creating a triangle of supernatural defense stronger than the original 7-point circle had ever been. The first darkness recoiled with a shriek that shattered crystal and stone as its assault was repelled by barriers renewed and concentrated. For the moment, at least, the world remained safe from ancient evils that would see it consumed. But the human evil standing before them with drawn sword was another matter entirely. The battle between kings was brief but decisive, as steel forged in honor met blades corrupted by dark alliance. Eric's sword, blessed by legitimate authority and strengthened by the renewed barriers, cut through Sigurd's defenses like light banishing shadow. The usurper fell with a cry that echoed not just through the chamber but across dimensions, as the powers that had backed his claim recoiled from their sudden defeat. The dark practitioners fled as their patron crumpled, their borrowed magic failing when the source of their corruption was severed. Commander Olaf and the remaining royal troops found themselves facing a choice between continuing to serve a dead pretender or accepting the authority of the rightful king whose crown blazed with divine legitimacy. "The war is over," Eric declared, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had never doubted this moment would come. "Those who served Sigurd in ignorance are pardoned. Those who served him knowing his true allegiance will face justice under the old laws." Hakon lowered his sword as the shadow entities retreated beyond the reinforced barriers, their forms dissolving like mist before sunrise. The silver pendant against his chest had cooled to normal temperature, its ravens seeming to rest peacefully now that their long vigil was complete. 6 months later, the kingdom had settled into a new rhythm under Eric's wise rule. The surviving bloodlines, Eriksson, Haraldsson, and Ragnarsson, worked together to maintain the concentrated barriers that protected the realm from supernatural threats. The 3-point triangle proved even more effective than the original 7-circle design, its focused power creating defenses that would endure for generations to come. Astrid stood in the restored great hall of her family's homestead, rebuilt with timber and stone that bore protective runes, ensuring no enemy would surprise its inhabitants again. The wooden box rested on her mother's old table, its artifacts now serving their intended purpose as tools of protection rather than objects of desperate flight. King Eric had offered her a place at court as royal keeper of the ancient mysteries, a position that would restore her family's status and provide comfortable security for the rest of her days. But the life of courtly duty held little appeal for someone who had tasted freedom and found purpose in guardian service. "I prefer the old ways," she had told him with a smile that reminded Eric of her grandmother's fierce independence. "The barriers need tenders who understand their true nature, not ceremony and protocol. Let me return to my family's lands and continue the work we were born to do." The silver pendant now hung around her neck, a gift from Hakon, who had decided that court life suited him even less than it appealed to her. The giant warrior had accepted Eric's offer of a position as royal guardian, but only on condition that his duties would take him to the far reaches of the kingdom where his sword would serve the common people rather than political necessity. "The old compact is restored," she said quietly to the portrait of her grandmother that now graced the mantel, painted from memory by an artist who understood the importance of honoring those who had sacrificed everything to preserve hope. "The barriers hold strong, and the rightful king sits upon his throne. Your duty is complete, grandmother, and mine begins anew." The ritual hammer rested in its place of honor above the fireplace, no longer needed for desperate magic but serving as a reminder that some powers should be wielded only when the world's survival hung in the balance. Next to it hung the crown seal of Harold Fairhair, returned to its proper place in the royal treasury, but not before being copied and blessed as a symbol of legitimate authority that would endure through future generations. A soft knock at the door announced a visitor whose presence brought immediate warmth to the rebuilt home. Hakon ducked through the doorway with the careful movements of someone who had learned to navigate spaces designed for smaller people, his weathered features brightening at the sight of tea prepared in the old style and bread baked according to recipes preserved through generations. "How goes the patrol of the northern borders?" Astrid asked, settling into the comfortable routine they had established during his monthly visits. "Quiet," he replied with satisfaction that spoke of a man who had found peace after decades of warfare. "The barriers hold strong, and the people sleep safely in their beds. The king's justice is fair, and his protection extends to the humblest farmer's cottage." "And you? Do you sleep safely in your bed?" Hakon's smile carried the contentment of someone who had found purpose worth preserving. "I sleep like a man who has seen the darkness held at bay and knows his efforts contributed to that victory. There is no greater peace than duty fulfilled and honor maintained." Through the window, the forest stretched green and peaceful under afternoon sunlight that no longer carried the weight of approaching doom. Children played in villages that would grow up never knowing how close the world had come to supernatural catastrophe. Farmers tended fields that would yield harvests for generations protected by barriers their grandchildren might dismiss as superstition. The compact endured, stronger for being concentrated and tested by adversity. The bloodline survived, wiser for having paid the price of vigilance in their family's blood. And in quiet moments between the demands of daily life, those who had stood guard against the darkness allowed themselves the simple pleasure of knowing they had proven worthy of their ancestors' trust. Sometimes the most extraordinary acts of courage lead to the most ordinary rewards. Peaceful days, quiet evenings, and the knowledge that future generations would have the chance to discover their own extraordinary courage when the time came to stand between the light and the darkness that would always press against the barriers of the world.